about you've got to recognize you're stressed, because if not, you're not going to put the interventions in place. What can be quite a challenge for us as well is that the sources of stress, we often talk about it in aviation of workplace pressures and stresses, etc. But lack of resources are all over.
Yeah.
You have to take a positive action to break the cycle.
Yeah, very good. And also speaking to people, I think, is really important.
The problem is the recognizing the stress
Yeah.
is actually really difficult, because it's quite often like cooking a frog, not in any way suggesting this is not my the views on eating there, but talking about extreme or chronic stress. You've not noticed that it's happened.
Yeah, that's really good.
And that's why it's really important to...
Well, Luke, it's good to have you back on the podcast. We are speaking about stress today. How are you feeling?
Well, a little stressed, if I'm honest with you.
Yep.
We've had quite the morning of it already, but yeah, it's a topic that affects all of us.
Yeah.
And I think it's really good to talk about, because one of those human factors, but also mental health things that can creep in and isn't necessarily getting the airtime many people would want to talk through.
Yeah, I think it's one of those topics that certainly from a male perspective, myself included, but growing up kind of just was expected to have that stiff upper lip.
Yes.
And, man up and crack on.
Yes.
And just cope with it all. Well, what's your experience with that?
I think it's quite interesting with stress. Actually, when we were talking about it and planning what we were going to talk about today, we went through all of the signs of stress, and you think, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
I'm actually ticking quite a lot of those boxes. And
Yeah.
for somebody who likes to feel they're quite self-aware and talks quite openly about human factors with people and how it can impact, actually, how aware am I that these things are impacting on my life as well?
Yeah, definitely. So before we go any further, I think we need a definition of what stress is, because we obviously in the aviation industry, we talk about it as part of one of the dirty dozen human factors.
Yes.
But it's kind of one of those mystical ones that gets a bit intertwined with pressure a lot of the time. So stress, definition.
It's basically lack of resources.
What do you mean by that, though?
Well, the thing is with resource is that there's lots of different types of resource. It's human resource, it's financial resource, but even things like commodities of time.
Yeah.
That lack of resource is what builds together to deliver that stressful scenario.
Okay, so in any given situation, we might feel pressure within our lives, within our working life, and within our personal lives. Pressure, I've often said that actually pressure's not bad. Pressure can be a really good thing. I know that I tend to, well, I think I work well under pressure. My wife would probably say otherwise. But I think I work quite well under pressure. But pressure for me turns to stress when the pressure of meeting a deadline with the finite amount of resources I have, and I've determined that I can achieve it. If one of those resources suddenly becomes scarce, like time that I have available is suddenly shortened for some reason, maybe one of my children's gone off sick, or a customer needs me elsewhere, or I've forgotten to do something, now I can start to think there's a lack of time, lack of resources, and I know that my body then responds to that in certain ways.
I think you're right. There's that difference between a little bit of stress is actually important. We have to have that arousal. But what we talk about here is actually what happens when that stress gets out of hand and becomes unmanageable.
So we're talking chronic stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's when it starts moving into that position where we're not able to deal with it the day to day. It doesn't heighten our performance, but instead is detrimental to it. And actually, as part of what we talked about here, we did a bit of a science research into it. Talks about an increase in cortisol. We won't worry about the science on that, but actually what that does is has the difficulty in the ability to recognize and monitor an internal state. So what is actually happening is your performance is diminishing, but you're not able to recognize it yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So there was some research that I read that had been conducted that suggests that when our body becomes stressed, so it's responding to maybe the lack of resources that we might subconsciously be aware of, there's this hormone release called cortisol. Now, the more cortisol that's released, we will experience something called self-awareness fade, which I think is fascinating. I know a lot of people experience self-awareness fade maybe at a weekend, maybe on a night out, but we're not necessarily talking about that today. We're talking about this self-awareness fade because my body's responding to stress and the cortisol. And that links in with what you were just saying a moment ago. So what are some of the other things that we can experience when this cortisol is flowing through our bodies and we are less self-aware.
Well, I've actually written some of them down, and this is why I
Great.
felt this bingo sheet as we talked through it was interesting. But increased irrational ability. Oh,
Yeah.
so actually that moment where we're a lot more rational about our thoughts and what we're doing, impulsivity or difficulty in managing frustration,
Yeah.
decreased ability to perceive social cues. So
Yeah.
actually we start misinterpreting what other people
Mm.
are thinking. And actually when you're in stressful situations, your mind goes along a certain route. If you're misinterpreting what people are thinking, you're adding quite often to your own stress.
Yeah.
You're creating scenarios that don't even necessarily exist,
Yeah.
which just compounds that effect.
Which also in turn would affect teamwork.
Absolutely.
It would affect the way we communicate with others. So if we're in a situation where maybe we're all feeling the pressure to get an aircraft out or to get to a certain destination and the environment's quite tough, maybe the weather's closing in, and if we're feeling stressed and we've got this lack of self-awareness growing, then how we communicate with others might be a bit more abrupt. They then interpret that through their own lens of misinterpreting why they're speaking to me like that. And so the cycle goes backwards and forwards
Exactly.
to the point where communication can completely break down.
Yeah. And I mean, with that feeds into this idea of poor judgment, riskier decisions, just generally that impact or stress on our ability to interact as part of a team or just perform day-to-day work is huge.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting there, you talked a little bit about stress in the workplace. When you're all in a stressful situation together, actually, in many ways, it's easier to spot because 5 of you perhaps working together, one of you is perhaps more likely to pick up on that cue of, hang on a minute, things are going a bit wrong here. What can be quite a challenge for us as well is that the sources of stress, we often talk about it in aviation of workplace pressures and stresses, etc. But lack of resources are all over.
Yeah.
Home stresses,
Yeah.
financial worries. I know we talked again about stress. I've turned around and have promised my wife that I will be home today for 1 o'clock for a midwife appointment, whilst also simultaneously messaging somebody else to say, absolutely no problem at all. I'll happily float into that meeting at 1 o'clock.
Yep.
That's not a good thing to do.
Yep.
And that's a huge source of stress.
Because you're going to let somebody down.
Exactly. And when you start going into that route, we go into the more the human factors element and the psychological element of what that does to people.
Yeah.
We quite often can induce stress in ourselves by making decisions like that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's come back to something else that we talked about a moment ago. So you were saying that actually when we're, let's say, a team and we're all feeling the stress, hopefully it's only acute in the moment. But as a team, we may be able to recognize that actually we're all feeling stressed due to the external situation. I think what's really important here to remember is that we all will have cortisol flowing through our bodies, which means we all could become less self-aware. And when you were just talking, something came up in I remembered from a marriage course that we did years ago, where we were talking about a problem that sometimes comes between two people. And this isn't just about marriage, this is about any relationship that we have with people. But oftentimes we can see the problem sitting between us. And actually what we need to do is put the problem out in front of us so that we both look at it front on together. So it's less in between us. Well, we need to do that in stressful situations, especially when working within a team, because that stressful situation has the potential to divide us, break down communication, break down teamwork, because we are all experiencing less self-awareness. We need to be aware of that and then actually recognize and have a bit of grace for people to think, actually, we're all in this together. Let's take a couple of minutes. Let's acknowledge this and let's see how we can best support each other whilst we try to get through what we're going through.
I think you're absolutely right. That humanity element in what we do day by day. The problem is the recognizing the stress is actually really difficult because it's quite often like cooking a frog, not in any way suggesting this is not my the views on eating there, but actually if you put a frog in boiling water and slowly turn up the heat, they don't notice that it's boiling. It's quite often the same with us in terms of our stress. That we start off in situations and it's good stress, it's motivating us, it's driving us to achieve deadlines, all of those good things. We feel alive and heightened and able to deliver. And then because of that, inflated, we're going well, we take on perhaps a little bit more, or we have other things, not even on work based, but a family curveball comes in, which pushes that stress level up and up and up and up.
Yeah.
And so before you realize it, you're in an element where you're talking about extreme or chronic stress. You've not noticed that it's happened.
Yeah, that's really good.
And that's why it's really important to work together as part of a team, and everybody having an awareness in that team of, actually, how is Sam normally? You know, he's normally really friendly and outgoing and helpful, and yet he's been a little bit snappy today. Is everything okay? You can start to recognize those social cues from other people. And the problem with stress, what do we turn around and say, is that recognizing social cues is one of the impacts of stress. But collaboratively, with all of you looking at that situation, one of you's in a better place to spot it.
Yeah.
Which is particularly helpful to then start dealing with those coping mechanisms of what are we going to do about this situation now? How are we going to impact it to stop this impacting the aviation safety bit that we're all working hard to achieve?
Yeah, that's very good. The analogy is putting a frog in cold water.
Oh, there you go. See?
So if you put a frog in cold water and then slowly turn up the heat, it won't jump out. It'll just boil alive. If you throw it into boiling water, it'll obviously jump out. But you're right. And I think this ties in very well with this theory called nudge theory, which is to do with psychology. But basically, we're saying if you slowly, just over a period of time, keep nudging somebody in a certain direction, or you keep increasing the small amounts of pressure that you're putting them under, over time, they'll just be adapting to that, but possibly negatively. It would be negatively affecting them. So over time, they can, if you said, well, let's take a snapshot now, and then in 6 months' time, if they viewed the two side by side, they'd be thinking, wow, there's no way I would have allowed myself to have been nudged in that direction and cope with everything I'm being asked to. However, they don't realize it because it's just gradual, it's bit by bit. Yeah. It's kind of this practical drift that we talk about sometimes.
That I completely agree. It's that moment of the sudden realization of how did we get this far? And quite often we have that stark realization when there's a safety event that may happen, reports come into the system and you look at it. And again, what we're talking about is working on the self-awareness to stop us having to get to that stage,
really
to
good.
take stock and realize that we're in that position. Genuinely, this morning when we were doing the preparation for this, that sudden realization of, oh, wow, I'm ticking so many more boxes than I should be here. But if we hadn't have done that, we'd have perhaps been 6 months down the line before talking about it. And
so now it's all about doing something about it.
It is.
So give me a couple of top tips that you've found or you've reflected on that actually we can do when we have the awareness that we are possibly trying to cope with more than we should be. Or if we've not got to that point yet, what are a couple of things we can be mindful of?
So I think we talk about the personal minima cards. We've talked about them before, and these are
great.
Yeah, it's a really helpful day-by-day tool to help recognize signs of stress. But it's more likely this will be the earlier days of it, when you start realizing actually there was an acute stress element that impacted on this task, as opposed to that cumulative effect. Yeah. But they're still incredibly useful tool to help support, have I been stressed in this particular task? But wider than that, when we start talking about the broader, more chronic, severe elements of stress, actually that self-awareness is a really important one.
Yeah.
Talking to people is important. So much of this comes about, you've got to recognize you're stressed, because if not, you're not going to put the interventions in place.
Yeah, very good.
But if you're able to have that network that supports you with that, realistic things that you can do. Set realistic goals.
Yep, great.
Don't turn around and say that you're going to be in 2 places at once at 1 o'clock today. I don't know whether my wife watches this or not, but she'll realize just quite what I've done later on. But actually work on identifying a healthy coping mechanism. The healthy coping mechanism is really hard because what is that normally? It's going for walks. It's perhaps going to the gym. You know, physical exercise can be a really good way of alleviating some of that stress. But if you're stressed due to overwhelm of work, do you have time to do that? No. Really do you feel you're going to be more stressed because you're now going to not do as much work and therefore go to the gym and make time for mindfulness?
Yeah.
Yes. And that can be really difficult for people to realize. You have to take a positive action to break the cycle.
Yeah, very good. And also speaking to people, I think is really important. Identifying 1 or 2 people that you could talk to, hopefully people at work, hopefully people in your personal life that you can share with. And I think as well as that, it's really important for leaders to specifically be aware of the gradual increasing amount of pressure that might be being placed on people that they are responsible for, and giving them opportunities, allowing them opportunities to actually speak up, check in with them more than just the annual appraisal,
Yeah.
and just see how they're doing, set them up for success.
I completely agree. And I think the one thing really to recognize is when you make that tipping point from day to day stress to something which is much more chronic and much more acute, it's really important to talk to people.
Yeah.
And if you don't feel you can talk with colleagues, there are lots of people out there and there are
Yeah.
lots of charities out there which you can actually have that sounding board with and go, actually, I'm really stressed. I need help in these interventions.
And we'll post those under this video.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
perfect.
Yeah, Luke, they're really great points that you've raised, and specifically signposting people to where they can get help if they need to. I think that's absolutely critical. There's first mental health first aiders a lot of times in organizations, which is great. But there's also anonymous helplines, and there's even the doctors.
Yeah.
And it's just, and if you know somebody in your own life that is going through a stressful situation, rather than just thinking they should, just man up and crack on, or this is good for them because it will build their resilience. Actually, and I've found this difficult before because I'm an engineer or mechanic by background. I like to fix things and come up with solutions. But actually, I've found that the most help I can often give is just by listening and saying, hey, how can I support you? Do you fancy a coffee? I'll just listen. That's what I do.
Great.
So yeah, hopefully this has helped some people, and we look forward to seeing people on the next episode.
Thanks so much.